Okay, welcome to the first episode of our new series on the 2024 Georgian elections. We decided to create this series to offer English-speaking audiences a comprehensive and alternative perspective on the political landscape in Georgia. With the upcoming elections being crucial for the country's future, it's more important than ever to understand the key players, issues, and dynamics that will shape the outcome. This election will be both divisive and decisive. The stakes are incredibly high, with the outcome likely to shape Georgia's future direction on key issues, from foreign policy to domestic governance. As the political landscape becomes increasingly polarized, understanding the underlying dynamics and the perspectives of different parties is more important than ever. Today's episode will provide an introduction to Georgia's electoral system and political parties, setting the stage for the deeper discussions we'll have in the weeks to come. We'll also dive into the latest developments, including the ongoing debate in the Constitutional Court over whether the controversial foreign influence law is unconstitutional. Additionally, we'll discuss the recent scandal involving one of the leading NGOs opposing the government, which initially planned to register under the law's directory, but backtracked after a public outcry. If you're new here and don't know much about Georgia, the country has been rocked by the biggest protests in its history over the controversial transparency on foreign influence law, pejoratively called the Russian law, which we'll discuss in more detail today. After 30 years of pro-Western neoliberal governments, opposition activists and politicians have increasingly framed the Georgian government as pro-Russian, particularly since 2019. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has only intensified this framing, reducing much of Georgian politics to a binary of Russian versus pro-Western, overshadowing other critical issues. So, before we begin, I would like to introduce the team to you. Revaz, would you like to go first?
Thank you, Sophia, for the introduction. I am Revaz Garanadze. I'm a political economist. I'm a labor organizer and also a former student activist. And I've been involved in Georgian politics for over 12 years now. Thank you.
Brian?
My name is Brian Gigantino. I'm originally from the United States, but live in Tbilisi, Georgia for the past 5 or 6 years. I'm a historian, a writer, and I'm researching Soviet history, Georgia's Soviet experience, and post-Soviet politics. And along with Sopo, I am the co-producer and co-host of the podcast Reimagining Soviet Georgia.
And Gio?
Hello, my name is Georgi Meschi. Currently, I am studying political science in Tbilisi. And for this show, I hope to provide young Georgian perspective on ongoing political processes. So yeah, that's...
And I'm Sopo Japaridze. I'm the head of a labor union. And I'm also a researcher and writer on labor and political issues. I also run the Reimagining Soviet Georgia podcast with Brian, and also have a Substack where I'm trying to keep English-speaking audiences apprised of what is happening in Georgia. So let's get into it. The first sort of hot topic, the scandal that happened around the Shame movement. Maybe, Brian, you can introduce the Shame movement before I go into what the scandal was.
So a quick short outline about the Shame movement. This was a group that came into existence in the summer of 2019 after a Russian Duma member, Sergei Gavrilov, visited Georgia ostensibly for a meeting on orthodoxy. And when Sergei Gavrilov entered the parliament, the Georgian parliament, he sat in the parliamentary speaker's chair and began addressing the parliament in the Russian language, which I think everybody found to be kind of an egregious act. And the opposition parliamentarians stormed out, called for protests. And then we had 2 weeks of protests, more or less, in Tbilisi in front of the parliament. And this this movement was called the protests in response to Gavrilov's Night, which saw massive protests. There was some police repression. A couple of people lost, one or two people lost their eyes. And but in response, the opposition used it as an opportunity to mobilize. And the Shame movement was born, which became kind of a quintessential NGO in Georgia that was receiving Western funding for over the next couple of years to mobilize against the Georgian Dream government, framing themselves as a organization that's committed to Georgia's Euro-Atlantic integration, a pro-Western NGO, and in centering opposition to Georgian Dream as a so-called Russian regime. They've been at the center of multiple controversies since, and they have been involved in a couple of different platforms and were also featured prominently on a 60 Minutes news show about Georgia last year, and presented themselves as kind of representing this anti-Georgian dream, anti-Russian, pro-European, pro-Euro-Atlantic integration opposition movement.
Yeah, and so they were, the leading organizers of these anti-foreign influence law, anti-Russian law, and all of a sudden they posted on Friday, I believe, a video which was actually quite well edited, I thought, that four of the leading, I guess, the leaders in this NGO said that they had really thought about it and that they were going to register in this directory as foreign influenced, and that in reality they're not so sensitive about being called agents, since they've always gotten people to say they were agents, so it's not that big of a deal. And also this law, the current law, the language was changed and no longer said foreign agent. It said, foreign power carrying out foreign powers' interests. And so, which was a huge problem for everyone, because the main argument against this law is that it was stigmatization, right? If they're saying that this does not stigmatize us, they pretty much handed the biggest payoff to the Georgian government, who's been saying this. So it's like the leading opposition pretty much validated the biggest government talking point about this law. So they felt like this was a huge betrayal. And as as a union person, I totally understand. It's like breaking a strike, right? They're like scabs. And so they were, I would say harassed, but they were in some ways, some forms harassed, but also shamed. There were just people just writing shame to them, the same thing. And it, I even went into Facebook to look for, shame, and it was like 5,400 people are talking about this right now. So it was like Facebook, which becomes like, the public space where everyone goes and writes. It was insane amounts of people just telling them they're like horrible people. We've always known you were liars, and we never trusted you, and so on and so on. But Gio and Rezi, what about you guys? What did you read while you were looking up all the shame movement stuff?
Well, I could say that the shame movement scandal is definitely one of the most shocking events that happened in Georgia recently. And the main reason is that the shame movement is the organization that, at least if not the first, it was one of the first ones that organized a protest against the transparency law. And even after the law, the bill at the time, the bill was amended and the word agent was taken out of it. I remember the shame movement was one of the organizations which are still argued that despite the fact that they took out the word agent, it doesn't mean that the law has changed in some great ways, and that they still opposed it as a quote unquote Russian law. But now that the registration date has come, they obviously changed um, their strategy. And the very people and the very narrative that they fed and they strengthened and organized has turned against them, and which is the most ironic part of this scandal, because they were basically the most aggressive and the like pioneers of these like protests. There was an interesting post on Facebook made by an opposition political activist, actually, Jacob Jangawadze. And he said that what Shea movement did was a double damage to the cause, the anti-law cause, because when they first announced that they would register as a foreign influence entity, they obviously gave validity, legitimacy to the law. And they claimed that they backtracked on their own like rhetoric that now they said that the word agent was taken out, so it doesn't really matter, so it's not a big a deal if they will register it. Then under the pressure they backtracked again. They promised that they would not register, and by that they gave the ruling party GD an excuse to say that, oh, this NGO, it was trying to be lawful, it was trying to register, but these other crazy NGOs, they just pressured the Shea movement, and they bullied them into submission. So not only did they validate the law, but they also gave the ruling party some like great talking points to exploit for next 2 months. So yeah, that's basically one of the craziest things that really happened last month. That because the prominence and like size of Shave movement is just so big that yeah, it had huge impacts, and I'm sure that it will have the consequences will show itself more during the next 2 months.
Yeah, just to build on that, actually, I do agree with Sopo, as she mentioned that Shame Movement actually is an NGO. Although everyone tries to portray Shame Movement to be a youth movement or some kind of grassroots movement, at the end of the day, if you look at it and how it was created, as Brian mentioned, most of the leaders, like Markarashvili, former leader of Shame Movement, and others, come from the main opposition party, quite right-wing parties, and therefore they were kind of built up to be a movement, but unfortunately, they somehow backtrack on that and are mostly an NGO. I myself come from a student movement, youth movement like Laboratory 1918, where we actually fought the right-wing authoritarian government. However, nowadays, the tables have changed, and the right-wing rhetoric that is very much dominant also by the ruling party, this Eurocentrism, and this Euro-Atlanticism, etc. This has become the cornerstone of the Georgian politics, and unfortunately, the non-governmental organization, the Shea movement, is a locomotive of these protests and try to portray itself as a grassroots or youth movement that would represent the people and represent the young voices of Georgia that were pro-Western. And that is all they want. And the shame itself the shame movement, the wording was directed to those who were critical to some of the positions that the government or the Eurosceptical population did take. However, the government was not very much Eurosceptic itself. So yeah, and now the backlash that has happened really did bring serious damage to the reputation of the Shea movement, because, for example, my cousin is a 18-year-old, and she was always attending, she used to attend all these rallies that were led by the Shea movement. And after the video that Shea movement released 2 days ago, I think, she told me that she lost hope in her future, because she's a young person. She very much believed in European integration, and she believed that Shea movement was really bringing hope to her and for her future, and fought for them. And then I asked her, but now after they retracted their position and they're not going to register, what do you think about it? And she told me that she still is very skeptical, because this was a huge heartbreak for her and the break of trust. So, that's how I see it. Also on Facebook comments, as you guys have mentioned.
Yeah, I think the damage is done, no matter if they backtracked, again, because they legitimized the biggest argument the opposition had, which was stigmatization. They said they did not stigmatize. So at the end of the day, the government kept saying, well, then you're against transparency. And they're like, no, 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 we're not against transparency. We're against stigmatization. So in reality, they pretty much confirmed that. So I'm going to move on from the shame movement and discuss the Constitutional Court, only because also the shame movement happened during the Constitutional Court hearings if this law was against the Constitution. So this is why it was also very explosive, because they announced it during this time, which the main arguments, I unfortunately could not watch all 3 days. I watched one full day. And so next week, I will discuss the other days the other 2 days and the closing arguments they had. But I'll give you like a brief what the main the opposition to this law, more were the main arguments, and how the government representatives, the parliament representatives defended themselves. And also just found it fascinating because I think it's like they had to make more like real arguments during the court than they had to outside of court. So they had to be a lot more disciplined with their messages instead of just sort of all over the place. And so that was also interesting. They had less room to maneuver in some ways, and they had to make these arguments within the Constitution. Also, wow, our Constitution really needs a lot of work as well. This is like my conclusion. Okay, so let me read. So Salome Zurabishvili, the president of Georgia, is the one who submitted this lawsuit saying that this law was against the Georgian constitution. She was also followed by NGOs, opposition politicians, and media. So everyone this law would affect, and also opposition politicians as well. And from the beginning, they asked for a linguist to discuss. They're going to have a linguist, which I haven't heard the linguist yet, but who was going to discuss how society understands this terminology and how this is going to stigmatize and sort of be repressive towards civil society and media. And this is why, again, the shame movement saying that it's not a big deal was so triggering. So their main arguments was this: stigmatization, so society will look at them as enemies, the high fines if you don't comply, personal information that can be requested. They said that transparency by itself was not a worthwhile cause. Transparency needs to have a purpose. The EU and NATO membership is in danger, and that media will be affected badly during elections because they will not be able to monitor it because of they could actually be liquidated because of the high fines, or the fact that a lot of people might see them as sort of public enemies. So Salome's representative opened it and said that if sort of background to this, that 14th of May, the president vetoed this bill, said it was unconstitutional, and wrote that this law was Russian. And they're like, and the parliament did not care that Salome said this. They overturned the law, and the president has to then sign the law, but she refused to sign it, and the parliament signed it into law. So that's a little background. That's what he talked about. And this is Article 78 that they're mostly working on. In Article 78 in Georgian Constitution, it says integration into European and Euro-Atlantic structures. The constitutional body shall take all measures within the scope of their competences to ensure the full integration of Georgia into the European Union and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, better known as NATO. So this is take all measures is the important part here that they kept discussing. So they said, don't forget that we have more people in support of Euro. We have most people in Georgia are in support of Euro-Atlantic integration, and that European values and civilization choice. This is the civilizational choice here. So they said the integration is value driven, and then he read the EU and NATO parts where it says it's all about European values and human rights and individual freedom. And then spoke about the positions of European NATO politicians and officials, saying that the law goes against European values and endangers membership in NATO and EU, and literally said many times a day, even every minute, there was a comment from these politicians against this law. Then they talk about Article 22, which is freedom of association. It says freedom of association shall be guaranteed. An association may only be dissolved by its own or a court decision in cases defined by law in accordance with the established procedure. So saying that this goes against freedom of association, this law leads to liquidation, personal information being divulged, freedom of expression is curbed, media freedom is curtailed, and their reputation is affected. And then we had another speaker, Eka Beseliam. I'm just going to go briefly over what she also said. She's like, our country's European future. This is the most important court in sort of the history of Georgia. Today, we're here to defend the Constitution, and defending the Constitution really was defending our right to join NATO and EU. Like, this is their big, like, moment here. And she said these are real fears. They're not imagined, that this is like a really harmful law, that we have occupiers at our doors, you know, our citizens are illegally detained, they kill our people. She's referencing Russia. And she said, like, it was so wonderful when she was in parliament in 2016, our constitution was so democratic, and people had assemblies and people could give their input, and this is how laws should be made. But I mean, I was part of that, you know, the constitution during 2016, and we did try to make our voice heard. We went to every single public hall meeting and they still didn't care what we wanted. So it's not quite how she portrays it at all. And then she said the Venice Commission said that every paragraph was wrong. They should completely be discarded. The Venice Commission did say that they had like a very huge critique of this law. So she said on 5th of April, the EU Parliament got a special resolution. The transparency law is against points 1 and 9 of the EU recommendations. There's 9 points the EU recommended Georgia has to do to be able to get into EU, and that it was violating 1 and 9. And that on 27th of June, the membership of Georgia was stopped. And then the sanctions Georgian government has been sanctioned, some of the officials, and it's still continuing. And then this has an effect on the NATO process. And that in the 4th of April in 2024, the NATO declaration, the Bucharest summit is no longer there, which was something about Georgia being able to join NATO. And this is a signal that this is quite damaging. I will have to stop for 1 second because my battery is low. So I will, give me 1 second. Can you hear me?
So then the judge was like, well, how will getting rid of this law change any of that, you know, if we've already been, you know, expelled and so on, we're no longer welcome. And she said, well, there's going to be a final evaluation in the fall. And so we should, if you abolish this law, consider it unconstitutional, we have a chance to be evaluated better, and then we can correct all these things. 1 second. I apologize. Then she said, then another speaker spoke, like this speaker was more about like, what is democracy? You know, we have 145 years of tradition of NGOs apparently in Georgia. I didn't know about that. This is a civilizational choice. This was repeated. She sort of waxed poetic about human rights, the backbone of society, media freedom, and so on and so on. And she emphasized that foreign money is independence. Independence, only defined continuously as this interesting part, is that independence to them only means being independent from the Georgian government, never actually means independence from other governments or other corporations or other, you know, billionaires and millionaires. So this very narrow understanding of independence. I think Ordzai, she discussed how this is actually really important. She said, we can't look at any other violation in the Constitution when it comes to rights without seeing it as a violation of Article 78. So she's saying that every single human rights violation is automatically a violation of doing everything possible to join EU and NATO. The judge was very concerned, asked to like, well, that's kind of crazy. Like, would we have to consider everything under this? So if there's any violation of rights, then would that be an automatic violation of 78? And so she didn't really answer very well on that. She kind of obfuscated. So then she said that the commission will make an evaluation, the European Commission, and that if we can have the Georgian courts defend Georgia, even though the parliament was bad, now the courts have a historic chance to be the face of Georgia and correct this. This is the last recourse, she said. And then we had Anna Natsrishvili. She was really the worst speaker, I think, of all of them. She really was like, got into this like crazy arguments about that this is like spying on people, listening in. The language hasn't changed in over 100 years. And she's brought up like purges of the 1930s and how they were all, it said that they were public enemies and spies. And here we are. And she kept referring to the Georgian government as empire. Empire thinks we don't know our history. The empire is trying to keep us down. I mean, it was really kind of ludicrous. And she's like, it's no coincidence that all these organizations, she's really referring to one, Sovlab, who are working on exposing the crimes of the empire, are the ones going to be affected by this law because they are NGOs. And then she's like, they're fighting for our national memory survival. She's acting like our national memory isn't like nationalist, anti-communist memory is in danger. And they're, fighting for this true memory of Georgia. And then I really thought she was like quoting like George Orwell. Like, she's like, 70 years of thought police, where we only obeyed, there was nothing else. And then she like quotes like MLK, like justice delayed is a justice denied. And it felt like somebody who like doesn't know anything about world history or anything but struggle as like a middle-class lady who just like stumbled upon like memes and like social justice memes, and like this was her like big revelations. They got a little bit better. She got better when she talked about real concrete things, like clearly this was not her strong point, where she says that the point 9 of the recommendations that EU gave to Georgia, this is human rights, democracy, rule of law, that was being endangered, which says something like human rights are the core of EU values as well as EU-Georgia relations. In Georgia, the EU supports the positive development of human rights practices, democracy, and rule of law. The association agreement concluded in 2016, and the association agenda guides us on EU-Georgia cooperation, human rights and democracy, and so on and so on. And then she talks about how Russians submitted this kind of law in the European Human Rights Court and won, and Russia was even like, well, at least in theory, they're not part of the Human Rights Court anymore, but they said like they had to pay reparations, and this was actually a law, they stigmatized them and so on. And then they had a journalist from Studio Monitor, and he started off like, this is a Russian law, and the judge was like, you're in court, can you refer to the law as its actual name? And he like didn't even know the name of the law officially. And so this was like brought up. He discussed confidentiality was a problem. Like they have scientists and people that do like investigations for them, and they pay them. And so they're afraid that this would expose their like secret, or like people who don't want to be exposed for why they're trying to investigate crimes of the government, say. And he also discussed how this gave like a green light to the people reacting very badly to them. And he showed pictures where I think his house was spray painted, like there were traitors and so on. The last guy was from IDFI. He was really bad. It was like, what does it mean for foreign influence, foreign powers? Like you could die for this country and somebody can say that you died for a foreign power. You know, it could be your idea, not foreigners' idea, and yet they will tell you it's foreign. And I thought this was like slightly funny in the sense that the way all of history is framed in Georgia is like no, the Georgian Bolsheviks, like Georgians, you know, Stalin, Georgian Orjonikidze, Georgian Beri, and so on and so on. Like they're not actually Georgian, right? They were enacting foreign power of Russia. And so the entire way everything is framed, including this law, is Russian. It's like Georgian government wrote a law and it's automatically considered Russian. So the things that they hate the most about this law is exactly how a lot of the narrative that they speak about everybody else. So quite unable to be self-critical there. And then he also talked about how the media organizations are actually businesses and need to stay competitive, so they shouldn't be revealing all their secrets. I'm still sick. He also talked about this was government sanctioned like bullying and harassment. And so, I mean, that actually is true in some ways because it does create a certain, we saw people were targeted, so on because of this, but they do also the same thing, they call it people Russians and Russian agents. So it's very difficult to sympathize completely when they do the same thing. So anyways, to sum it up, they make the claim that stigmatization, the fines are too high, the EU NATO path is derailed, and the human rights are European values, and that's being all jeopardized. The defense spoke, defense of parliament, and said that we really haven't heard about all these other paragraphs, freedom of association, very much. They're like, they refer to Georgian law as Russian law, but they don't want to be labeled as foreign power actors. And they also never mention the differences between the Russian version and Georgian version. And talks about how the NGOs call themselves civil society, that they are standing for civil society, and other foreign foreign powers call them civil society. And that this is actually important later on, you'll see, because if civil society, so-called civil society, has to take part in all decision making, just as EU wants, then shouldn't the people actually know who this civil society is, who's paying them, you know, how they're spending money? I thought that was actually a good argument in that sense. Then they said that this actually law is very value neutral. They're not here to harm organizations. Foreign isn't a bad word. Interest isn't a bad word. She's like, you know, USAID has, we are doing things for the American interest, you know. UK aid has the same thing, and every other sort of donors or from countries or even just like democracy or so on, they all say we are working in the interests of whatever, our country, our democracy, and so on. So the word interest is not really a bad word. She said facts cannot be stigmatized. And then she said that actually EU and European Human Rights Court, there were cases when it had to do with Hungary and Russia where the judges ruled that transparency was a legitimate aim of the government, because that was questioned before if transparency is a legitimate aim or not. They said they had to have a purpose, and she said, no, actually, it's in these courts, there are judgments that say that transparency is a legitimate aim. Then she said that she counterposed the Constitution, Article 17, as counter to what they said was like freedom of association was in danger. And she said, no, we're actually trying to be constitutional with rights to freedom of opinion, information, mass media, and internet. She's like, people have the right to know. So actually, we're trying to help people get levers, right? Understand who is representing civil society and so on. So actually, they were empowering the people instead of disempowering the NGOs. And then she said there was like a problem with sovereignty, and sovereignty needs to be guaranteed. And two arguments were like NGOs like paid fines of jailed politicians, and there was also the technocratic government to exist. So the government should step down, and technocratic government should be in charge. She said that was like, you know, practically an overthrow, undemocratic, because the people were supposed to vote, and so they try to curb, you know, democracy by placing a technocratic government. That actually was a real thing that happened. And then they were like, how come? And this other guy was like, how come you never mentioned paragraph 12? So they paragraph or article. So the opposition put in lots of articles in the Constitution that they were violating, but then when it came down to speak about them, they only mentioned pretty much 2 articles, which was the right of, you know, to associate and European Union and NATO integration. So they're like, why didn't you mention Article 12, the right to free personal development, or Article 15, rights to personal and family privacy? And they were like, they repeated, like, no one's going to storm your apartments or your offices. This is just a request. They can make a request, a written request to get information from you. You do not comply. The only mechanism they have is fines. And I said that, like, I mean, the judge was like, why did you choose like 20% instead of 80%? Or how come only 20%? And this was actually a good question, and they had a really bad answer. They're like, well, we used it from the American FARA, you know, like, that's not really a good answer. That doesn't make any sense. Why choose 20%? So, you know, very weak arguments there. And they pushed back on freedom of expression also means getting information, and so on and so on. And then this was actually really funny. You know, when they said like, well, shouldn't we know then who is part of the government, like all the laws are being made? Shouldn't we know that who are the civil society that's taking part in decision making? And the judge was like, so are you saying that foreign people who are carrying out interests of foreign powers are making decisions about the government, about laws? And the defense, the parliament was like, yeah, you should know who are these people. But there was like the opposition media tried to make this like a gotcha, like they pretty much are saying that foreigners should be involved in making laws for Georgia. But in reality, it's not a gotcha, because even our constitution literally says we work to satisfy, you know, NATO and EU demands, which are both foreign entities. So it's not like, oh, gotcha. Like, yes, I think that's actually a problem. Like, the government is not actually going far enough in saying that, right? But that's exactly what it is. Like, foreigners, literally directly foreigners, and we are satisfying foreign, you know, EU, NATO, you know, recommendations and directives. And then the judge was, I thought this was the best argument against this law, was like, it's retroactive, so you have to submit all 2023 documents. And the judge is like, but this was not mandated. So what if they didn't keep those records, right? You can't ask somebody to give you records where you weren't mandated to have these records, to keep them. And I felt like you try to answer and it's really kind of bad. And in reality, you should not expect you know, anyone to have information on things they weren't expected to keep in 2023 when this law did not exist. So I think that's actually a really good argument against this law. And then I think the biggest thing was as well, like the defense said, make sure that we don't see every single thing through a prism of 78, Article 78, right? So it becomes like any violation, like I said before, we look at it as like, oh, if you violate this, then you must be breaking the EU NATO law or directives or, you know, recommendations, and use like 4 different examples of how they won against Akhalaya Ugulava Melia Saakashvili. And they talked about different parts of the decision-making in European Human Rights Court. And one of the important things were almost all the time, those plaintiffs were using comments from politicians to prove that they were being harassed or they were being oppressed by Georgian government. And the EU court said that was not satisfactory, that legally it has no basis. So this whole argument that EU politicians and NATO politicians are saying that this is a bad law cannot be legally meaningful because there's these 4 other cases where that was not the case. And then the judge, I thought was really interesting, goes, what about the EU Parliament resolution? And I was like, kind of like surprised how the judge doesn't know that EU Parliament means nothing. But he was like, well, actually, let me get to that. He's like, well, there was this EU Parliament resolution that about Misha Saakashvili, about him being imprisoned, and that they said that they were going to lose EU membership if they didn't comply with releasing Misha, yet they still got the EU membership. So it's like he clearly demonstrated that the EU Parliament means nothing in that way. Anyway, so this was a wrap up of day 1. I will talk about it more. This is very long, I know, but hopefully informative. Any comments from you all?
Maybe I can add a bit because I listened to the part where they invited the linguist. At least partially, I listened to it. Well, I kind of have a problem with the argument overall because it's actually one of the oldest arguments that they have. They have been regurgitating that argument ever since and overemphasizing on it, the linguistic part of it. Like, arguing over semantics basically, is agent a bad word or is foreign influence a bad word? But even the fact that the argument itself, at least for me, is unsatisfactory, the execution of it was even worse. They were completely unprepared for it. One of the funnier examples of that was that the fact that the lawyer forgot the name of the witness, the linguist. The linguist's name is Marina Beridze, and lawyer called him Manana twice. And the judge had to fix the name. The judge had to intervene in that. So the whole argument that Marina Beridze presented was that even if the fact that the bill was changed and now they don't use the word agent, now they use the word foreign influence, which has bad connotations because of our so-called Soviet history. She says, kind of without any kind of historical context, that in the Soviet Union, foreign power was such a bad word that if you were affiliated with the foreign power, then you were the bad guy. Obviously not mentioning the fact that it was a Cold War, so everybody was kind of aware of foreign powers. So she says that because of that, for example, for people like her who lived in the Soviet Union, the foreign power or foreign influence has extremely bad connotations with it, and it just stigmatizes these NGOs who receive the foreign funding. And because it was badly executed, the Dream Party, the government kind of exploited that with their arguments as well. But the point is that it just, for me, I don't think that Georgian people really resonate with that argument at all. I don't think that anybody actually in Georgia cares about these semantics, whether it's like agent or foreign influence affiliated person. What I think is that the opposition actually had a really good argument, which they didn't emphasize as much as this like wording part, which is Sopa also mentioned it, the 20% fact. I think if they pushed it a little bit further, it would have been a way better argument, because actually I have the same concern um, as they would have if they had presented it. There's like a great argument is that what if there's an NGO in Georgia which receives only 20% of the funding from the foreign powers, let's say, and 80% of that funding comes from Georgian sources? Then how can we say that it's a foreign entity? How can we say that it's influenced by a foreign entity, I mean? But I think that they just wouldn't use that argument as much, because that means that then the Georgian dream can kind of like compromise with them, maybe like increase the threshold, while their goal is to like completely remove the bill. So I think that's why they didn't really talk about that part that much, even though I think that with the Georgian population, that would resonate much more than, the linguistic part. And instead of that, they obviously talked way much more. Even during the linguistic parts, they still mentioned Euro integration, and this like foreign influence stuff. and they mention Soviet Union time and again, as if like it's one of the biggest argument that they could come up with. So in that sense, I'm quite disappointed because I thought that because this is a core, so I would, one would think that they would bring in some like actually good arguments, and they did, but they just never went with it far enough. So instead of making this like an opportunity to create and like let's say somewhat of an actually democratic debate about a law, they continued the old tradition of just screaming about the Soviet Union and like how the wording is bad in the law. So yeah, that's what I'm kind of disappointed about, or what I wanted to say.
I think it's because they had to make an argument why it was unconstitutional. So the 80% wouldn't really fold up in that. That's why they had to come up with all these ways to somehow this was an unconstitutional thing. The strongest case was their EU, but honestly, they don't really have a strong case why it's unconstitutional. But yeah, I totally agree.
Can I go? Yeah. So for me, the whole court, just shows me how deep this pro-Western zealotry is, in the country, and how it looms large in our political lives. Because now, Sopo and Georgi, you both talked about like 80 to 20% ratio, right? And then the government's position was, well, that's in the United States, well, that's in the West, and on the other hand, you have the representatives of the president and the opposition and the NGOs, like Gabeseli, who was a former GD, right? They talked about how it will hurt the constitution and how it is a civilizational choice. For me, it seems that these people are very far from educating themselves about the human rights. Just if you look at the current affairs, what's going on with the protests in European countries, if you look at Germany, how human rights are being violated every day for the pro-Palestine protesters, how anti-genocide protesters and conferences are being banned, and actually the right to free speech has been, revoked, those basically for many people, from universities to workers in fish markets, for example. In France, we saw that. And to see European Union as a civilizational choice where the human rights are sacrosanct is an uneducated perspective at best from my point of view. And also, if you see this as a civilizational choice, I would rather also go deeper and ask them, what do they mean by civilization choice, and what is more than human rights, or do they mean something else? Because I find it very Eurocentric. I find a little bit of also racist, and I find it really overlooks all the current genocides that the Western powers are involved. However, the biggest problem here is the Constitution's 78th article that basically makes us to be a country that has in its constitution to be an aspirational political entity that wants to become part of imperialist military alliance like the NATO. And I'm not going to go further what NATO is. I think we've all seen through its history what it has done. And I think that is a huge problem. And if the government, and now I have to criticize the government, if the government's answer is that we need a strong sovereign country, then how come you have a strong sovereign country where your strong sovereign country basically has in its own constitution to become an entity, to become an aspirational entity for foreign military and political and economic alliances? I don't think that any country that wants to be sovereign, any country that wants to be political independent, has this kind of article enshrined within its constitution. It can be a political focus by the government or by any political force, but to have that in a constitution, I think that is a huge problem that needs to be addressed by the forces like government who proclaim to be the defendants defenders of the Georgian stability.
I was just reading how, go back to more the meat and potatoes, but like the Linguist Institute, like director said that, Marina, right? So the linguist that was there, that she does not represent the Linguist Institute, like the position. And then somebody else in the Linguist Institute was like, no, the director does not represent. So now they're having a linguist breakout, like fight between them, which is just ridiculous, but I mean, expected. Okay.
Actually, that I'll say like one additional comment because they talked about that in the court. I think the judge asked her, no, either the judge or the like the GD lawyer asked her whether it is her like single opinion or opinion of all of the linguists in Georgia, and she quite confidently said that it is not an opinion, but fact which is supported by all of the linguists in Georgia. So now that you said that, it just reminded me of it.
More wars.
I just
yeah, Brian, did you want to say a comment?
I just want to mention, I'll make my comment very quick. One of the interesting points Sopo originally mentioned was this, focus by, I think it was Anna Natsishvili, during the Constitutional Court hearing on empire and this role of external powers. And I think it's interesting to see how in the past few months, the opposition media has focused quite heavily on Georgian Dream's instrumentalization of this phrase, the global war party, basically as a euphemism for certain actors within the Western alliances, the United States, within the European Union, and has kind of, pressed that as being this ridiculous phrase. And then, of course, we see that at the highest constitutional court level, that maybe an even more abstract term is being used to try to justify a position on this law on foreign influence, that empire, a vaguely defined empire, an external force. So I thought it's kind of interesting to see how on both sides they're playing. One is begetting the other in terms of who's the external evil power that's, manipulating Georgia. And then the second thing I wanted to say, which Rivaz went into deeply and very well, was about Article 78 in the Constitution, which I think is something that we're seeing that through this discussion on the law of foreign influence is actually reaching a certain limit, because I think that one of the main problems Georgia faces is that the idea of being, as Rivaz said, an aspirant country towards the European Union and NATO is basically institutionalized and it become a structural part of managing politics in Georgia. And the question we have to ask ourselves as leftists and others who are thinking critically is like, how can Georgia politically overcome this structural limitation of being an aspirant country when these are not things that Georgia has ever had or will ever have actual control over, joining NATO or the European Union. They can't actually make the decision to join the European Union. And so how can this politically be overcome, and what can be offered, as a way of like overcoming the structural limitation? So,
I mean, it says literally all means. The article, I mean, what a crazy article, but I think,
and I think,
yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. Last point too is that we also have to remember that when we talk about how these this anti-Soviet memory politics, like Sopo was mentioning, are constant theme in the discussions in the Constitutional Court, that really like they're on the line too is this narrative about Georgian history, which I think is very interesting about what does the Soviet past represent? Was this a period of development or a period of occupation? Was this a part of Georgian history or an externally imposed piece of history, or a very complex history that has nuances that need to be investigated? And this is, and I think it's important to consider that, the United States through USAID has been doubling down on reinforcing a very narrow historical narrative about Georgia, and they're funding projects like SovLab and others to reproduce a very narrow narrative of the fact that the Soviet period was occupation, externally enforced, imposed, and actually a period of trauma and Georgian victimization. And that's one of the main reasons why these history and memory political battles are quite consequential and important.
Yeah, for 70 years, all we did was obey. So Rezi wants to say something, and then we should move on to the political system. So Rezi, make your comment, and then once you finish your comment, just start talking about the political system.
Okay, just to go to Brian's point of view about like this has been like constant, it has been institutionalized. I don't know if you guys remember, but when I was studying, when I was doing my bachelor's degree at the university, there was a Ministry of Euro-Atlantic Integration. And this Ministry of Euro-Atlantic Integration generally did all the main conferences, because I studied politics and international relations, and they were like, everyone wanted to be, everyone wanted to do their internship there, and it was very popular. However, it was still in place when GD came into power, and now it's a department within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So there is, and one of the deputy ministers of foreign affairs actually is the head of this Department of Euro-Atlantic Integration. Anyways, now let me go to another segment that's very important. As we're discussing elections, it's very important to understand what kind of electoral system and what kind of electoral politics does Georgia have. Considering the fact that the electoral system in Georgia has been a point of debates, arguments, and even the revolution sometime, it has been a very, very crucial and important issue. What kind of electoral system Georgia have? Since 2008, the ruling party, then ruling party, UNM, has promised Georgia that it had super majority, super constitutional majority, and for it not to happen, they would implement to change the electoral system. We had a single-member constituency electoral system that was also mixed with party-list proportional system. Basically, what you have is we have 150 members of parliament. There's no second chamber, and out of 150 members of parliament, 75 were elected proportionally, and 75 were elected through a single-member constituency. For example, it's basically a mixture of the British and the Dutch electoral system, because the Dutch have full proportional system and the British have the same as Americans. The one, it's a FTPT, it's about the individual candidates, and the candidate in the constituency who gets the plurality of the votes, not even the majority, will carry a seat. Therefore, it has been a debate around this issue, and finally UNM consented. Nevertheless, the only change they did for 2012 elections was they changed 75 to 75. They gave 77 to proportional representation. 77 seats were allocated to proportional representation, and 73 seats were allocated through individual single-member constituency, but also through plurality, FTPT. When the Georgian Dream came, it still promised the electoral reform, and everything would become proportional representation. However, GD did not uphold this promise for 2016 elections, and what they did was they introduced two-round system for the individual single-member constituencies. Instead of plurality of the votes, you now needed a simple majority. That basically means, like in France, you have two-round system, and you need to have 50+% of votes in order to carry a seat or carry a district. This was the change still did not come till in 2020. Although after my co-host discussed the shame movement and the protest and the Gavrilov's night in 2019, there was a huge protest because of this, and the founder of the Georgian Dream party, Bizina Ivanishvili, promised the young people protesting in the streets that the threshold will be reduced from will be decreased from 5% to 1%. And therefore, I think first time in 16 years we've had a multi-party parliament, because lots of parties were able to overcome 1% threshold. Now, in the 9th parliament, in the 10th parliament between 2020 and 2024, the issue of electoral reform was still very much hot. However, the government consented and said that from 2024, the elections will be held through a proportional party list system for all 150 constituencies, members of parliament, and single member constituencies will be revoked. And however, the threshold of 5% was not changed. And the UNM, that is the major opposition party and the former ruling party, voted, like majority of the UNM actually voted with the GD. So they are the two parties that would always benefit from 5% threshold, because if many parties won't be able to overcome 5% threshold, then the rest of the seats that will remain will be allocated to those parties or coalitions that will be represented in the parliament. So we are what our system is offering is a d'Hondt method. Basically, it's a simple proportional system where the seats that are not allocated because of the threshold are being then proportionally allocated to the parties that were able to overcome the threshold. In addition to this, another important part of the reform is about the coalitions and the single parties. So what do I mean by that? So if several parties want to join and create an electoral block, it's called block in Georgian, then they need to have a threshold at 7%. However, many parties think that this was very difficult and they joined forces. And what do I mean by that? They did not create official formal coalitions, but they created informal coalitions, and the several parties would participate in elections under one party, and the seats among them is distributed by the negotiations. Like, for example, Lelo, that is run by the former famous oligarch and a banker that is quite famous for evicting people and take their homes. We can discuss that later when we go through the coalition itself, is the leader of Lelo party. Is Mamuk Akhazadze, his name is. So, for example, other parties, there are 3 parties joined this, the Lelo, and they will not participate as separate entities, but they will participate as party list. They will have their names in the party list of Lelo. So the coalitions are not officially registered coalitions as a coalition blocks that we used to have before, but these are the informal coalitions that are negotiated, and mostly the richest and most dominant party will take in the members of other parties in their informal coalition. And after the elections are over, some of these members of different parties then have chance to create their own parliamentary faction if they have 7 MPs. But that's up for debate and for discussion within their coalitions. And now talking about coalitions and talking about the parties, our next segment would actually really is very interesting, because we're going to dissect and go and have a overlook about the parties. However, if you guys have any comment about the electoral system or the coalitions before we go there, thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Revaz. Kiyo and Brian, let's talk about the coalitions, and I'm gonna put up the political compass that you made. Let me share it. Here you go.
Okay. Yeah, great.
Everyone
great.
see it?
I can see it.
Okay.
Yeah. So I made this political compass, which I know that probably not even all of my co-hosts completely agree with, but I thought that for people who just don't really know about Georgian politics, and especially Georgian party politics, it would just be a very familiar format to show them where these political parties stand in the very like famous, like economically left, economically right, socially liberal, socially conservative. Like everybody knows that. So in these elections, we outlined seven prominent political entities. Four of them are, excuse me, Ravas, but I'll say that they're coalitions, even though I know that they're formally not coalitions, but for all intents and purposes, I'll call them coalitions. These coalitions are the Strong Georgia, which is headed by Lelo for Georgia. Then there's a Coalition for Change, which is headed by Achali, a breakaway party from UNM. Then there's also Unity Platform, which is headed by the UNM, the previous government. And the last prominent coalition is the Georgian Dream Coalition, which is obviously headed by the Georgian Dream. And also there's a fifth coalition, I forgot, which is the Conservative Coalition, but they don't have an official name yet, so I'll just call them the Conservatives. There are also two additional independent parties, which at least get 1 to 2 to 3% of the vote every election. This is Girchi, the original Girchi, which is the chairman is Iago Khuchia, and there's also a new party, relatively new party, I guess, Gacharias for Georgia Party, which is also not part of any kind of coalition. So maybe I'll start talking about the Georgian Dream Coalition because it's the ruling party. So the Georgian Dream Coalition is comprised of two parties, which is obviously the Georgian Dream itself and the People's Power Party. So the People's Power Party was formed by Georgian MPs who actually left the Georgian Dream. So they used to be the Georgian Dream politicians. The party chairman is Sozar Subari. But despite the fact that they left the Georgian Dream, they still associate with them quite often. And as you can see, they joined the coalition with them. The difference between the Georgian Dream and the People's Power is that People's Power is, I guess, slightly more conservative. One of the People's Power party member owns a conservative media outlet, which is called OSTV. It is a quite known media outlet in Georgia, but not as significant as other ones. But it's known for being like a conservative spokesperson, other than, I guess, Alt Info in Georgia. Other than the fact, the coalition is completely dominated by the Georgian Dream, the actual Georgian Dream. So the ruling party, Georgian Dream, was established by Georgia's single billionaire, Bidzina Ivanishvili, in 2012. And it was the main opposition party to the previous government, UNM. And since the 2012, they have won absolutely every election, presidential, parliamentary, and municipal elections. Despite the fact that the Georgian Dream characterizes itself as social democrats, I would say that their political thought has fluctuated a lot. Initially they were like quite radically neoliberal. Then they did actually implement some of the somewhat leftist programs like universal healthcare coverage. Then recently they have started playing into this like conservative ideals because they want to attract more conservative voters in Georgia. I guess their social democracy is quite questionable. Um, they have in their party program that they want to create a social state, but even though they were in power for 12 years, we don't really see it coming. Um, so yeah, maybe like other people also want to say something about Georgian Dream and the People's Party.
So the logo is, just to point out, the logo is the blue logo in the center that has a 7-pointed star, and it's like center right party, just to mention. Yeah. maybe I'll talk about the Georgian Dream when we actually have an episode on it. So, yeah.
Okay, then maybe
Yeah, I
Brian
think
could
it's
introduce one of the
important
conditions.
to
Oh, okay.
talk about the fact that the Georgian Dream has generally been a party that has met the moment politically. So first it was like Yo said, typical neoliberal, kind of party with only one really social. They came to power promising these social things like healthcare, factory work, and so on. And even the healthcare, they went back to targeted healthcare. So they came from saying they're going to do universal healthcare. Then it became too expensive, and then they just said, "Oh well, we're going to go back to targeted." So since then, since the last about 3 years, they have reformatted to become more like Hungary, like kind of a socially conservative politics, which they weren't at first. But I think that's they're trying to figure out how to stay sort of pro-Western sphere, but then stay on their terms because the competition is from the other neoliberals who want to take them out. Um, and I think that because there's no alternatives for any kind of socialist or leftist governments, what's the difference between liberals and social democrats in Europe, really? When it comes to way they treat Georgia, they're pretty much the same. So I think that there's an attempt to figure out how to get their base, what is already organically there, a lot of conservative issues, a lot of conservative thoughts, and I think that they're doing I want to say a Karl Rove strategy, which is getting their base out. So I think that everything they're doing now is they're not even talking to the liberals anymore. They're not even trying to in any way. Before they were trying to always bridge and speak and do platform for the liberals. Now they're completely done. We're only going to talk to our base. We're only going to do what our base wants, and that's being anti-gay laws, that's conservatism, that's this and that. So yeah, that's all I wanted to add.
One thing I will add about Georgian Dream is that recently there was a issue where they had been mentioning the idea about making the Georgian Orthodox Church the state religion, and then it seemed as though the Georgian Orthodox Church either didn't agree to this or had some disagreements with Georgian Dream. And then, of course, they publicly tried to reposition themselves and say, well, we're going to emphasize it in the Constitution as a way to kind of show that they're the most pro-church force in the country, without necessarily the church agreeing to becoming this state religion, or there being some kind of disagreement maybe behind closed doors between GD leadership and the church. Ravaz, did you want to say something?
I would add one last comment about Georgian Dream, from my own perspective. It's how Georgian Dream changed, at least in my view, in recent years, because Georgian Dream has been in power since 2012, and from 2012 up until I would say very recently, maybe 2 3 years ago, for me at least personally, Georgian Dream was something like a foreign entity. It's some power that holds the government, and is loosely connected to my life, and it didn't really feel like it was a party at all, and feels like a couple maybe 2 3 years ago, since 2022 2023, maybe even 2021, they started to act more like a party. They started showing their power. They started producing their own policies, for the worse or for the better, and they are now more like a power to be reckoned with, because they're not, let's say, hiding in the shadows anymore. They're quite upfront about their power. They're quite upfront about their influence and their desires. That, for example, the fact that Bidzem Ivanishvili said that he wants Georgian Dream to be the ruling government in 2030 as well. So in that sense, Georgian Dream kind of developed from this mess of people who just kind of hated UNM. They just hated the previous government, and that was their whole shtick. And now they're transforming. They still haven't like completed the transformation, but they're like slowly transforming into the like actual party. Whether they'll in the end choose the social democratic platform or conservative platform, I'm not sure. They're leaning towards the conservative part, but at least what I can say is that recently Georgian Dream has been acting more like a party than it has been like last 7, 8 years. So yeah, that's my finishing comment on Georgian Dream.
Okay, I'm just going to do a very brief overview of a couple of the other parties that are running. And then in our next episodes, we will try to go a little more deeper into the nature of the parties. One of the other coalitions or blocks that's going to be running in the elections is this Coalition for Change, which includes Girchi, More Freedom. There's two Girchi parties, the Droa party, and Ahali. And I believe also the Republicans is one of the smaller partners in this coalition. And I'm going to just say a couple of things about these parties, and I will go and explain more in a following episode. But this is the three major parties. It seems as though one thing to mention is that in Georgia, opposition parties are not necessarily very ideologically coherent. And a lot of the times, especially now, what we're seeing is that these parties are trying to figure out what's the best strategy for opposing Georgian Dream, not what should our ideology be and how are we going to change the country. And I think that actually is a key factor in understanding how these parties even develop their ideas. However, within this Coalition for Change, Girchi, More Freedom, Metsi Tabasupleba is a party that is a fundamentalist libertarian in the American sense party. They are basically anarcho-capitalists, extremely pro-market, extremely openly pro-Atlanticist, and the leader of the party is a man named Zurab Japaridze, and like other maybe you've already caught on to this, that a lot of people form parties after splitting with other ones, right? So United National Movement, which was in power from 2003 until 2012 with Mikhail Saakashvili's leader, of course, has hemorrhaged into all of these smaller parties. Zurab Japaridze, leading this Girchi party, basically is the most ideological of them all, holding this idea of the kind of libertarianism, fundamentalist pro-Atlanticism. And as Sopo mentioned, that Georgian Dream is kind of a party trying to make sense of the times, you can imagine Japaridze more as this relic from a moment of like 2004, 2005. He's basically not changed and is trying to still mobilize people on this kind of idea of American unipolarity, unrepentant globalization, market fundamentalism that I think both the left and the right and even the center in most countries have rejected. And so he's still pushing this, walking around Tbilisi with an NRA hat, for example. And so that is the idea of Girchi, pro-drug legalization, pro-small government. And actually, what's interesting is that this Coalition for Change has basically embraced the economic policies of Girchi as their ideological position. For example, they recently had a video where they promoted their economic platform, which was privatization, low taxes, and a very libertarian, economic liberal fundamentalist position. Okay, then in this Coalition for Change, we also have DROA, which I would say is basically the party that doesn't have an ideology from anything I can tell on their website or anything they say. It's basically just a personalist party of this woman, Ellen Khoshtaria, who was deputy minister in the State Ministry for Euro-Atlantic Integration from 2007 to 2012. And she's basically created a personalist party to try to basically get into power. And I think this is important to understand that there is a lot of formations like this in Georgia. And so she's holding forth her own political career through this party. Then you've also got Ahali, which is a party that was founded by Nika Gvaramia and Nika Melia. Melia used to be part of the United National Movement and Gvaramia as well. But Gvaramia is a very famous guy because he was the director of it's a different story, this TV station, Rustavi 2, and founded Matavari Archi as another opposition TV station. He also was put into jail and then pardoned by Salome Zurabashvili. And again, I would say that Ahali is less about ideas and more about trying to strategically figure out how to come to power. And through this kind of coalition. And then I'm just going to mention two other things very quickly, and then we can kind of wrap up. And again, we're going to go into more detail on some of these parties later. We're going to have a whole episode where we dissect the United National Movement, which was the previous government in power. And I don't want to go too far, but this was the party of Mikhail Saakashvili of the government in Georgia from 2003 to 2012, and they are now part of a coalition with Strategy Agmashenabeli, which was a party founded by also a former UNM member, Georgi Vashadze, which he founded in 2016. He used to be in parliament from 2012 to 2016. They're running, and again, they're basically a center-right party. They're promoting also this kind of idea of Atlanticism, being the more pro-European. They are socially conservative in reality, but kind of trying to present themselves as not. And they have a simultaneous kind of like loyal voter base who love the previous government, but also they repulse a very large segment of the society because of the fact that they were the previous government. So they'll never really probably ever be a majority again, but they're going to continue running under the brand of UNM. And of course, they've come, the Georgian Dream Party, as Ravaz mentioned in a comment, that they are also basing their legitimacy off of being anti-UNM, and that is actually something that a large segment of the population still adheres to. And then the last thing I'm going to say is there is this, as Georgi mentioned, this conservative coalition that is led by the Alliance of Patriots, whose leader Irma Inashvili is kind of the figurehead of, and they are socially conservative. They believe in reconciliation with Russia, and they are a kind of skeptical, Eurosceptic in some sense. And they have kind of come together in this, they signed a thing called the Declaration of the Georgian Patriots Unity, but that includes a couple of parties, the conservative movement, people from this group, Alt Info, and also from other conservative groups that are pushing more of a national conservatism. And we will explain more about their policies in coming episodes. And that is a general outline of the parties and blocs. If anybody has anything to add that I might have missed, which I could have.
Sopo, can you please turn that back on, because I have two more parties to discuss, and then I'll wrap everything up.
Yes, 1 second.
So yeah, the two parties, well, one is the coalition. So I'll start with the coalition. The coalition, Strong Georgia, its logo is the peace sign. So economically right and slightly socially conservative. Members of the coalition are Lelo for Georgia, which is the leader of the coalition, because the logo is actually Lelo party logo, not the coalition's logo. There's also Citizens Party and the For People Party. And I'll use like Brian's point about some other parties, that For People Party is also kind of centered around its leader, which is Anadolidze. And a bunch of these parties actually are kind of just really just centered around one single person, the leader, not the ideas. So yeah, definitely the stronger of these three parties is Lelo for Georgia, which is founded by and another Georgian rich businessman, Mamka Khazaradze. For 2 decades, he was a chairman of the directorial board of the largest Georgian bank, which is TBC. But he had to resign in 2019 after the Georgian state prosecuted him for money laundering, and this caused like a big scandal, which is still unresolved. But other than the bank, Khazaradze is involved in many other quite profitable businesses, such as production of mineral waters in Georgia. So having a businessman as a founder of the party, it definitely influences Lelo, just like it does, for example, GD. They're part of the ALDE party, which is Alliance of Liberals and Democrats of Europe. Lelo's and like more personally Hazaradze's ideals are, let's say, confusing at best. Hazaradze has mentioned that the business must be fully independent from the government because he's a businessman. That's what he would obviously think. But at the same time, he said that the businesses should have social responsibilities like normal wages, green and sustainable development, and so on and so on. So the question is quite clear. If the government will not force the businesses to, let's say, develop the economy in a green, environmentally friendly way, and increase the wages and so on, how is this like socially responsible business going to come in Georgia? On this question, they don't offer any kind of answer. In fact, they don't offer an answer on many questions. For example, in like couple of interviews, they talked about like these social policies that they're going to carry out, but they never give a definitive answer. And when they do give an answer, it's so clear that it's like quite fantastical and just like out of reality that even other opposition parties make fun of it. For example, the fact that Khazardze promised that the Georgian pensions would suddenly rise from 300 lari to 1,000 lari, which every party kind of made fun of it. Now, Lelo's relationship with its now ally, Citizen Party, is rocky at best. Because the chairman of the party, Alek Elisashvili, called Khazaradze an usher on a live broadcast, and added to that Khazaradze is responsible for fleecing the Georgian population and filling up his pockets with stolen money. This happened not that long ago, a couple of years ago, I think in 2021. And Lelo Party founder only started getting into politics because he is like fearing persecution from the government. That's what Alek Olisashvili said. But despite that, they still, I guess, managed to create a coalition. Regarding the Four People Party, led by Anadolidze, not much can be said because it's quite a personal party. Just she was a popular figure in Georgian politics for like 5 seconds. She had her moment in the sun, and then it faded, and she had to join the party to, stay relevant. She doesn't really have any kind of like politics that would stand out from even Lilo, for example. But yeah, I guess that despite the personal differences, the strong Georgia coalition kind of united under the idea that they would defeat the so-called two-party system in Georgia. So the two-party system is UNM and GD. That is their main goal. Other than the fact that they're just promising to defeat this two-party system, they don't really offer anything that Georgian Dream and UNM doesn't offer already. Um, and whatever they offer, as I said, is mostly like filled with populist promises. Moreover, they have a so-called National Defense Act with 8 steps, and all of those 8 steps are concerned with Russia. They propose imposing harsher economic sanctions on Russia than even most of the European, actually all of the European nations have. And I guess it's up to you to think what the consequences of such rash actions would be for Georgia, especially considering that even Europe struggled with those sanctions. So if nobody has any comments on strong Georgia, I can move to the next party, which is For Georgia. Okay. For Georgia is a party which is founded by Gacharia, who's also an ex-GD politician. So we have this like a tradition of some politicians leaving GD and forming their own party. But for Gacharia, I can say that he was actually one of the more successful politicians in GD because he was prime minister of Georgia right before his like resignation and establishment of his own party. Gacharia's career in GD ended during this massive protest that Brian mentioned previously, and those anti-Russian protests that happened after State Duma member Gavrilov visited the Georgian parliament and he spoke in the parliament in Russian language. And this sparked like huge protests in Georgia, And what was scrutinized was Gaharia's reaction to those protests, because especially on 20th and 21st of July, under the pretense of defending the parliament, Gaharia's policemen used the rubber bullets on protesters, injuring several people. And I think, like 2 or 3 people even lost their eyes, which earned him a nickname, Twaltharia, which basically means like eye plucker or something like that for the ex-prime minister. Um, After leaving GD, he initially had some support, but I think that support, it didn't decrease, but it kind of stagnated. And despite the splitting, interestingly, just like for the other party, the People's Power Party, Gacharia also maintained the conservative talking points that GD has. Gacharia himself and his other like party higher-ups have mentioned a couple of times that children must be protected from all kind of propaganda, especially the LGBT propaganda, and that they want to like create a social basis for a strong, united Georgian family, and that Georgian family will be like basically the basis of the Georgian state, just like conservative ideology usually talks. Um, and that's why they were on the verge of supporting Georgian Dream's constitutional change, which is about like family values and LGBT topic, like so-called LGBT propaganda topic. But they just backtrack on it because they are already quite because Gahare is already quite infamous amongst the opposition because of the July protest events. He didn't want to make himself even more unpopular. So he said that, oh, we must protect the children from the LGBT propaganda, but GD is doing even worse. And he's one thing that we can say about the Gacharia party is it's always somewhere in the middle between the government and the opposition. And that's why they're in no coalition, because I don't think that any other party wants to affiliate itself with Gaharia's party. And the GD also said goodbye to Gaharia, I think forever. So they kind of stand alone. So if you guys have any last comments before we wrap it up, it will be the
Yeah.
perfect time.
Go ahead.
So, like it's interesting because Gaharia was a business ombudsman in the beginning. He was the rights defender of businesses, and he was during the Georgian Dream government, and he was appointed to the ministerial post of Ministry of Economy. And then he was, as Georgi mentioned, he became quite unpopular when he dispersed the protests and became the Aiplaka Gaharia. However, then he was promoted to the to become a prime minister. But the falling out of Gaharia and GD is quite mysterious, and we might discuss it when we really go deeper, because he resigned when Georgian Dream was trying to arrest Melia, and he said, I don't want my hands in this, And Gaharia's party now, as you mentioned, also many people saw Gaharia's party to be an alternative to GD and the UNAM during the 2021 local elections. And actually, Tbilisi mayoral candidate Kahek Aladze was not able to secure his election in the first round because Gaharia took away a lot of votes from the GD. And as a result, in Batumi, in Zugdidi, in Rustavi, GD lost majorities in the local city or town assemblies, and Gaharia's party decided to go in coalitions with the UNM and UNM majority. However, then UNM also lost the majority because Achali and Guaramia's party, as Brian discussed, they split from the UNM, and so UNM also lost the majority in Zugdid. So they're really interesting dynamics we are going to delve in, I think. Sorry, Sapo, please go ahead.
No, yeah, our strike in the miners' strike in Tripoli, Gacharia came in to crush it, and he did successfully. But yeah, I know he's also big in Samegrelo. As a Megrelian, do you feel like you're betraying Gacharia?
I wanted to say that because I was born in Zugdidi, and for I think like last couple of years and even slightly right now, he's definitely the most popular party outside of UNM and GD. I think GD is still substantially more popular in Zugdidi than Gacharia is. But yeah, Gacharia still holds at least some kind of sway, and they still have somewhat of a successful mobilizations in Zugdidi. They opened new offices there. They had like quite recently. I was there when it happened. They had a like some kind of ceremony. They invited everybody. They invited my grandma as well. So yeah, it's in Zugdidi they have some kind of support, but I think it's not as big as they hoped it would be. And as I said, it kind of stagnated. They hoped that it would go up and up and up, and at certain point it did go up, but then it just never pushed beyond that. And I think I don't think that they'll secure more votes this election, but I think they might cross the 5% barrier.
Yeah, the funny thing is, like, lots of my friends or my neighbors in Bagan district in Tbilisi actually voted for Gacharia. They thought that this was an alternative. And now it's polling like very low because they made a coalition with the UNM, because Baga is like very much anti-UNM thing. And it's interesting how Gacharia would fare in these elections. Yeah, sorry.
Okay, we should wrap this up. So last
Okay.
comments.
If there isn't any, I can wrap it up.
Yeah, we should wrap it up.
Okay.
Not too long.
So this is it for the first episode. Today we started our conversation with the latest hot topic concerning the major Georgian NGO, the Shame Movement. We talked about how the Shame Movement became a victim of a moralistic witch hunt, which they themselves had started several months ago. Then we continued with the breakdown of the current constitutional court debate. The prominent NGOs, oppositional MPs, journalists, and even the president have all submitted a case against the Foreign Influence Transparency Law. The Constitutional Court hearings have been going on for several days already. For the next segment, our political economist Revaz Karanadze explained to us the current Georgian electoral system and how we got there. And at last, we discussed all the major political coalitions and that are going to participate in 2024 elections. We talked about their origins, their policies, their ideological differences or lack thereof, and the scandals concerning them. For the next episode, we're preparing a long conversation on the biggest social and economic challenges in Georgia and how each party is planning to tackle them. So thank you for watching.
Thank you. Bye. Until next time.